The Sackler dynasty. You know their name. You've walked past it carved into marble on museum walls. You've seen it printed in gold lettering on university buildings. You've heard it whispered with reverence in rooms full of donors and elites. But here's what they never wanted you to know. What the plaques don't tell you. What the lectures never mention. What the museums hide behind velvet ropes and curated exhibits. The Sacklers didn't build their empire on art, or science, or generosity. They built it on addiction. They built it on a pill that turned American towns into graveyards. They built it on a lie, so bold it rewrote the rules of medicine. They built it on a drug that detonated families from the inside out. And then they walked away untouched. While America burned, the Sacklers bought legacy. They bought respect. They bought silence. They bought immortality. Their name didn't rise from brilliance. It rose from suffering. Millions suffering. Millions addicted. Hundreds of thousands dead. And it all started with one family's hunger for power. Arthur Sackler, the man who cracked the code. The man who figured out how to sell mass addiction disguised as healthcare. The man who weaponized marketing like a scalpel. He didn't just promote drugs. He hypnotized the medical system. He turned doctors into sales agents. He turned patients into revenue streams. He turned pain into profit. He invented the playbook every pharma giant still uses. He rewrote the rules. Then he passed the torch to the next generation. And when the Sacklers finally unleashed OxyContin, they didn't just introduce a drug. They declared war on America. They didn't just target pain. They targeted every worker, every parent, every kid with a sports injury, every person who trusted their doctor to help them, not destroy them. The Sacklers took an opioid meant for cancer patients and fed it to an entire nation. They promised it was safe. They swore it wasn't addictive. They printed claims they knew were lies. They manipulated data. They ghostwrote research. They bribed experts. They flooded the system with propaganda. And while doctors believed them, while patients swallowed the pills, while the country spiraled deeper into dependency, the Sacklers counted the money. Billions. Staggering billions, stacked on suffering, stacked on ruined lives, stacked on broken towns. And when overdose deaths exploded, when morgues overflowed, when communities collapsed, the Sacklers blamed the victims. They blamed the people they hooked. They blamed the families they destroyed. They blamed the addicts their drug created. They never admitted fault. Not once, not ever. They didn't apologize. They didn't feel shame. They didn't lose a dime. Because they built the perfect system. A system that let them poison a nation and walk away billionaires. Their company took the fall. They did not. Their name got removed from museum walls. Their fortune did not. Their reputation cracked. Their dynasty remained. This is not a tragedy. This is not a mistake. This is not a misunderstanding. This is a conspiracy of wealth, a conspiracy of power, a conspiracy that stretched from corporate boardrooms to medical journals to regulators to institutions built on Sackler donations. And it worked. They didn't just get away with it. They won. The Sacklers didn't just manipulate the system. They built the system. They engineered it from the ground up. They saw a country full of pain and turned it into a gold mine. They didn't treat suffering. They monetized it. They didn't help people. They harvested them. And they did it with precision. First, they rewrote the meaning of pain. Pain is the fifth vital sign, a slogan masquerading as medicine, a phrase invented to push pills, not to help patients. Suddenly, every doctor in America was trained to believe pain needed aggressive treatment. Suddenly, patients were told they deserved to live pain-free. Suddenly, discomfort became a disease, And the cure? OxyContin. The Sacklers paid for the committees that wrote the guidelines. They funded the organizations that taught doctors. They sponsored the conferences that shaped policy. They controlled the entire conversation from top to bottom. They didn't just sell a drug. They sold the illusion that the drug was safe. And while doctors were being misled, Purdue's sales reps were trained like soldiers. They hunted for high-prescribing doctors. They targeted people desperate for solutions. They pushed higher and higher doses, knowing each step up meant more dependency, more repeat customers, more profit. They had maps showing which communities were collapsing faster than others, maps highlighting which towns were drowning in addiction, maps that read like a battlefield diagram. The Sacklers didn't retreat from these areas. They doubled down. If a town was falling apart, Purdue sent more reps. If addiction rates spiked, Purdue increased sales quotas. If overdoses rose, Purdue blamed the addicts and kept pushing. Because in their system, suffering wasn't a warning sign. It was a growth opportunity. And while communities descended into chaos, the Sacklers built palaces of influence. Museums named wings after them. Universities named institutes after them. Powerful cultural institutions paraded their donations as proof of philanthropy. But every Sackler wing, every Sackler institute, every Sackler center carried the same hidden truth. Built on addiction, built on deception, built on death. Their money was dirty, but the world didn't care. The world only cared about the checks, and the Sacklers knew this. They knew prestige could bury scandal. They knew philanthropy could launder reputation. They knew influence could silence critics. So they spread their money everywhere. Harvard, Yale, Oxford, the Met, the Louvre, the Guggenheim. Every donation bought them another layer of protection, because when a family's name is etched into the walls of elite institutions, those institutions become shields. Who wants to expose the truth about the people funding their programs? Who wants to bite the hand that bankrolls their prestige? Who wants to lose access to that wealth? No one. And so, the Sacklers continued their campaign, while families buried loved ones, while millions suffered withdrawal, while addiction tore through towns like a wildfire. The Sacklers lived in luxury. Untouchable, shielded by lawyers, insulated by wealth. Protected by walls of influence, they built piece by piece, dollar by dollar. And even when the lawsuits started stacking up, even when Purdue pled guilty, even when the truth finally clawed its way into the public eye, the Sacklers were already safe. They moved more than $10 billion out of Purdue before the company imploded. They prepared for the fallout years in advance. They saw it coming. They planned around it. So when the bankruptcy hit, when the settlements were announced, when the headlines screamed accountability, the truth was simple. The Sacklers were already gone. Their money was gone. Their fortune was untouched. OxyContin went down. Purdue went down. Communities went down. But the Sackler dynasty remained intact. The Sacklers didn't just escape, they reinvented themselves. They watched the world burn and decided the solution wasn't accountability. It wasn't remorse. It wasn't responsibility. It was image management. The moment the heat turned up, the moment the lawsuits gained traction, the moment people started connecting the dots, the Sacklers activated their second empire. Reputation laundering. They hired crisis PR teams. They hired lawyers who specialize in blaming everyone except the guilty. They released statements dripping with corporate vagueness and legal precision. They pretended they were deeply troubled by the epidemic they helped create. But behind closed doors, behind sealed depositions, behind layers of lawyers, the tone was different. They talked about optics, about liability, about how much money they could protect, about which assets to hide first, about which family members should disappear from the public eye. Not once did they discuss the victims. Not once did they talk about the dead. Not once did they acknowledge the millions trapped in addiction. Not once did they confront the humanity of the crisis. Because that's the thing about power. It dehumanizes everything beneath it. To the Sacklers, addiction wasn't human tragedy. It was a calculation, a revenue stream, a quarterly metric. They didn't see the mother crying over her son's overdose. They didn't see the father losing his job because he couldn't stop taking pills. They didn't see the child raised by grandparents because both parents were gone. They didn't see the towns turning into hollow shells of themselves. They saw numbers. They saw profit margins. They saw market penetration. They saw opportunity. Pain became profit. Addiction became profit. Suffering became profit. And every dollar earned was another layer of insulation. The Sacklers knew how America works better than most Americans ever will. They knew. If you get rich enough, you become untouchable. If you donate enough, you become respected. If you network enough, you become protected. If you influence enough, you become untouchable. And if tragedy follows in your wake, well, that's not your problem. That's the system. That's bad doctors. That's abusers. That's misuse. They turned the blame into a weapon. They turned addiction into a moral failure instead of a corporate design. They turned victims into villains. They turned public outrage into static. And they turned the entire crisis into something they could walk away from. This wasn't negligence. This wasn't incompetence. This wasn't ignorance. This was strategy. A strategy perfected across decades. A strategy inherited from Arthur Sackler. A strategy that exploited institutions at every level. And while America's overdose numbers climbed, while towns became shadows of themselves, while families buried loved ones far too young, the Sacklers were busy expanding their art collections. They were buying properties. They were buying influence. They were buying respectability. Because they knew something the rest of the world is only now waking up to. In America, it's not justice that matters. It's narrative. And the Sacklers controlled the narrative. They controlled the research. They controlled the messaging. They controlled the talking points. They controlled the experts. They controlled the institutions that shape culture itself. And when all else failed, they controlled the escape plan. When the lawsuits finally broke through the facade, when the truth became impossible to bury, when the victims' families stood in courtrooms demanding justice, you would think the system would finally step up. You would think the hammer would fall. You would think the people responsible would face consequences. But this is America. And in America, justice has two speeds. One speed for the poor, one speed for the powerful. And the Sacklers were not just powerful. They were power itself. Politicians talk tough until money enters the room. Institutions posture until donations are at stake. Regulators regulate until they meet the people they're supposed to regulate. And the Sacklers navigated all of it with cold precision. When the government demanded accountability, the Sacklers offered settlements, not admissions, not guilt, not remorse, money. Their favorite weapon. Billions in payouts, but only from Purdue, not from the family, not from the personal fortune they had siphoned out of the company for years. The Sacklers played a game the courts weren't prepared for. They separated themselves from the corporation. They created legal distance. They built layers of protection. They drained Purdue dry long before the lawsuits landed. So by the time the hammer finally came down, there was nothing left to hit. The Sacklers didn't pay the price. They paid the lawyers to make sure they wouldn't. And while Americans imagine accountability looks like perp walks and handcuffs, the Sacklers demonstrated what accountability really looks like for the elite. A fine, a settlement, a carefully worded apology posted online, a quiet transfer of assets, a champagne toast in another country. Meanwhile, the families who lost loved ones, they got pennies, literal pennies compared to the billions the Sacklers kept. It wasn't justice. It was insult. You know what real justice would look like? The Sacklers standing before the families they destroyed. The Sacklers facing the communities they shattered. The Sacklers explaining how they turned pain into profit. The Sacklers accounting for every life ruined. But instead, they do what they've always done. Disappear. They melt into the shadows of wealth, into the circles of privilege that protect them, into the gated worlds where accountability cannot reach them. And the institutions that once flaunted their name, that flaunted their money, that flaunted their generosity, those institutions quietly removed the Sackler plaques. Not because it was right, not because they finally grew a conscience, but because public pressure became too loud to ignore. They didn't reject the Sacklers when the money flowed in. They rejected them when the money became radioactive. The Met ignored the source until it became public shame. The Guggenheim ignored the truth until activists made it impossible. Universities ignored the blood trail until students protested. This wasn't morality. This was damage control. And what about the billions? What about the fortune built on addiction? What about the wealth that financed the destruction of countless lives? The Sacklers still have it. It is protected. It is secure. It is untouched by accountability, and it will be passed down to the next generation. A dynasty born in deception. A dynasty built on human suffering. A dynasty that cannot be erased by removing a name from a wall. Because the truth is this: you can take their name down from the buildings, but you can't take their fingerprints off the bodies. The Sacklers didn't just profit from an epidemic. They architected the blueprint for the world we live in now. A world where addiction is industrial, where misery is monetized, where corporations calculate the acceptable number of ruined lives, where billionaires rewrite their legacy with donations sprinkled like perfume over a corpse. They didn't create a drug. They created a cycle, a machine, a self-feeding system. First, they flood the nation with an addictive substance. Then, the system collapses. Then, regulators scramble. Then, communities break. Then, the illicit market takes over. Then, fentanyl arrives. Then, death becomes a national rhythm. And while an entire country sifts through the ashes, the Sacklers quietly move on. They pass down the wealth. They pass down the trust funds. They pass down the insulation. They pass down the dynasty. The Sacklers live in a world untouched by consequence. A world where the pain of millions never crosses the walls of their estates. A world governed by lawyers, accountants, and influence. A world where accountability is something that happens to other people. Because that's the real lesson here, the one no one wants to say out loud. The opioid epidemic wasn't an accident. It wasn't a tragedy of circumstances. It wasn't a medical oversight. It was engineered, profited from, exploited, protected, and scaled. And when the system finally noticed, the damage was already permanent. What do you do with a dynasty that built its empire on the broken bodies of a nation? What do you do with a family that has destroyed more lives than some wars? What do you do with the elites who designed a crisis and then vanished behind a fortress of wealth? The truth is painful but unavoidable. You can't touch them. You can't punish them. You can't force justice on people who purchased immunity decades ago. Even when their name is scrubbed from museums, their money remains in the foundations. Even when universities distance themselves, their influence lingers in endowments. Even when the world finally calls them what they are, their wealth sits untouched, ready to fund the next version of their legacy. The Sacklers got away with it. Not because the world didn't know, but because the world waited too long to care. And the result is all around us. Families torn apart, generations scarred, communities hollowed out, a nation addicted, a new drug crisis rising from the ashes of the last one, and at the root of it all, the decisions made in corporate boardrooms by people who never saw the inside of the towns they destroyed. The Sacklers will be remembered. Not the way they wanted. Not the way they paid for. Not the way they tried to carve into stone. They will be remembered for what they truly were. America's modern opium kings. A dynasty built on deception. A dynasty protected by power. A dynasty that poisoned a nation and walked away richer than ever. And the country they left behind is still bleeding. Addiction didn't end. The epidemic didn't fade. The consequences didn't disappear. The Sacklers did. That is their legacy, and it will outlive them.